Good morning. My name is Brad Hunt. I'm from the Newberry Library. I'm filling in for John Locke, who just told me minutes ago that he wanted to work with Michael Barone on a future project, and we needed to corner him in the limited time that Michael had this morning. So I'm going to fill in and introduce our panels today on Midwestern regionalism. Our first speaker is going to be Bruce Bigelow from Butler University on the American Midwest, a region or anti-region. I'm sorry that I don't have your bios in the last minute nature of this. Butler University, terrific. Why don't you take it away, and then I'll introduce the others as we go along. Thank you.
All right, so let me begin. I hope I can use the technology positively. So I have a series of 20 slides I'm going to be talking over very quickly. I only have 18 minutes. So my paper is The American Midwest, Region or Anti-Region. In 2001, historian Andrew Caton created a controversy when he argued that the Midwest was an anti-region rather than a distinct region in American society. He claimed this because the Midwest had 5 faults that prevented it from being a region. Fuzzy or imprecise borders, lack of a strong and distinct voice because the residents were too pacific and nice, lack of isolation geographically that would allow it to be different, no formative event that gave the region distinctness, and internal subdivisions that gave the region significant lack of uniformity. Some scholars have agreed with Caton, but others have not. Joel Jarreau, a journalist, in his popular book, The 9 Nations of North America, and there you can see them on the map, broke the Midwestern area into 2 significantly different regions. The Foundry, what many think of as the Eastern Midwest, but also including the Northeast by Jarreau, and the Breadbasket, what people think of as the Western Midwest, but Jarreau included Prairie, Canada, and Texas. Jarreau emphasized the economic base in defining these regions. He even went so far as to say, quote, "There is no such thing as the Midwest," end of quote. So there you see the Foundry and the Breadbasket. Colin Woodard, another journalist, in American Nations, A History of the 11 rather than 9, Rival Regional Cultures of North America, also broke the Midwestern area into 3 different regions. In this case, though, from north to south rather than east to west, based upon migrations from the East Coast. Yankeedom, mainly New Englanders and upstate New Yorkers, Midlanders from Pennsylvania, and Greater Appalachia from the upland south, respectively. So he did not have the distinct Midwest. Raymond Gastill, a scholar of cultural history in cultural regions of the U.S., broke the Midwest into 2 regions from north to south, including the upper Midwest and the central Midwest, respectively. And we also have a blow-up of those regions from Gastill. Wilbur Zielinski and Donald Meyer, 2 academic historical cultural geographers from Penn State and Syracuse, respectively, believe that a Midwest did indeed exist as one integrated region, although their borders were not exactly the same. Zielinski included all of Ohio and even western Pennsylvania in the Midwest, whereas Minot excludes the eastern quarter of Ohio in the Midwest. Cleveland, for example, not being a Midwestern city. Also, Zelensky excluded the Western Great Plains from the Midwest. That's its western border. It doesn't include the Great Plains. Whereas Meinig included all of the Great Plains in the Midwest based on the contiguous latitudinal migration from the bordering prairie states into the Great Plains. Meinig also included Oklahoma, or at least northern Oklahoma, in the Midwest, whereas Zelensky considered Oklahoma to be a unique region unto itself. In order to analyze the controversy over whether the Midwest exists as a distinct region, I turned to John Agnew, a political geographer from UCLA. In his article, Arguing with Regions, Agnew identified 7 controversies with regard to regional analysis. Formal versus functional regions, real versus constructed, long-term versus recently developed, fixed spatial containers versus mobility, context of social life versus case study, backward versus advanced, and nationalization thesis, whether or not it persisted as a region or was subverted by national culture. So, the first one, formal versus functional region. What does that mean? By this, Agnew meant regions where the space within is uniform without vocality. That would be a formal region. Versus regions that have networks with a hierarchy of cities binding the region together. I would argue that Chicago has served as the functional capital or focus of the Midwest, especially based on William Cronin's narrative in Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great Plains. So to me, it's a functional region. 2, real versus constructed region. By this, Agnew meant regions defined by the folk or a vernacular region versus regions that are defined by academics and writers without regard for the views of the folk that live in the region. That would be a constructed region rather than a real one. Both Zelensky and geographer James Shortridge have defined vernacular regions based on a naming of businesses, Zelensky, in their using the Midwest as their title in the businesses, or in this case, a perception of college students, respectively. Although their maps are not exactly alike, nonetheless, they do define a vernacular Midwest. 2 other surveys of folk also indicated that there was a Midwest culture region centered on the 12 states defined in the census as East North Central or West North Central. These states include, as you all know, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. In addition, a significant minority believed that states that bordered these 12 states were also in the Midwest, especially Oklahoma, as you can see on the map. Midwest, and that is at least partly Midwestern based upon this survey done of folk. And another survey done of folk indicates a somewhat similar situation with Oklahoma sort of in the Midwest based upon this study. We also have the study done by Joseph Brownell, a geographer, where he asked the local postmasters whether or not they were in the Midwest or not. If it's a black dot, they said yes, and if it's an open white dot, they said no. And again, you can see the map pretty generally is like the ones we saw before, the 12 states that people think are in the Midwest usually, based on the census, and Oklahoma, according to the local postmasters. I did a survey of Butler University students in my upper Division American Midwest history class, 18 students, and the results were similar, especially with regard to Zelensky's map of the businesses that said Midwest, probably because they were in Butler's in the East and Midwest, and therefore they particularly identified the states in a solid line as particularly in the Midwest. Further west you go, people at Butler, particularly Indiana or Chicago kids, think that those areas are not so much in the Midwest as you can see from the map. I also asked them, what does it mean to say you're in the Midwest as a culture? And these are the results. Simplicity, rurality, and agriculture was mentioned by 9 of the 18 students, or half of them, as was friendliness or community. Family, 7. Conservatism, 6. Dialect, vocabulary, accent, excuse the spelling, 5. All right, I think I need to go back, sorry, here, to Agnew to remind you what we're talking about. All right, so I did 1 and 2. Now I'm getting to number 3, long-term versus recent development. By this, Agnew emphasized that regions can be different based upon their longevity. The Midwest has existed as a large, distinct region based upon its perceived location and images for nearly 150 years. So it is a long-term region. Number 4, fixed spatial container versus mobility. By this, Agnew meant regions of great persistence of residence versus regions with a lack of persistence. Obviously, the Midwest is a region that lacks persistence. Nonetheless, most townships and cities have had a core of persisters who maintain social order and regional identity. Number 5, the region is a context of social life versus a case study for the nation. By this, Agnew meant studies that took into consideration the regional culture versus studies that ignored the regional culture, even though the Midwest was being studied, because the researchers were only interested in national trends. There's been a number of studies that dealt with the regional culture. For example, Lloyd Warner of the University of Chicago did a sociological study of Morris, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, for his analysis of democracy and equality, entitled Democracy in Jonesville, which did take into consideration that Morris was in the Midwest. On the other hand, Robert and Helen Lynn studied Muncie, Indiana, as a case study of national trends of industrialization in a small city in the 1920s, entitled, as you probably all know, Middletown, a study of modern American culture, where they were not interested in the regional culture, but were looking for national trends. Number 6, backward versus advanced regions. By this, Agnew differentiated poverty-stricken areas from affluent areas. Generally, the Midwest has been perceived as an affluent region since the 1850s to the 1970s. Then it flipped to being an economically challenged area entitled the Rust Belt. And then 7, nationalization thesis of local, regional versus national identity. By this, Agnew highlighted that all nation states become more centralized over time and share a powerful national culture that subverts local or regional cultures. However, in the structure of federalism in the U.S., one can argue that that thesis is overdrawn. The federal system invites the persistence of local and regional voices different from Washington, D.C. And the Northeastern core area. This theme is at the heart of contemporary American politics, within the Beltway versus outside of the Beltway. In summary, the Midwest does have fuzzy borders, especially along its eastern, southern, and western edges. An area I call the periphery, on this map, the periphery, in contrast to the central core area centered on Chicago. the core. The Midwest also has important sub-regional differences in identity based on urban hinterlands, for example, Chicagoland, sub-states, for example, southern Indiana, for example, Hoosiers versus Wolverines. The Midwest is also in the middle of the nation, but has a distinct identity apart from the Northeast, the South, or the Far West, based on resentment towards the Northeast, opposition to slavery towards the South, and a distinctive geographical base and historical development different from the Far West. It also has a sense of relative pacifism and niceness that makes the Midwest better, especially related to loud, aggressive, and rude Northeasterners. In addition, the regional culture of the Midwest is based on high social capital. According to Robert Putnam in his famous study, Bowling Alone, social capital based upon Putnam is 14 variables that relate to community organizational life, measures of engagement in public affairs, measures of community volunteerism, measures of informal sociability, and measures of social trust, all of which create a vibrant regional culture. The Midwest is a national leader in social capital according to Putnam. Quoting Putnam, the primary, as you see on this map, the primary high pressure zone is centered over the headwaters of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers and extends east and west along the Canadian border. The primary low pressure, or poor areas of social capital, are centered on the Mississippi Delta and extends outward in rising concentric circles through the former Confederacy. California and the mid-Atlantic states lie near the national average. End of quote. The Midwest also does have a formative event. The Civil War. While the Northeasterners were stalled near the Potomac in attempting to defeat the Confederates in the capital area near Richmond from 1861 to 1863, the Midwesterners quickly claimed major victories in the West at Shiloh and Vicksburg. It was only when Midwesterners took over leadership of the fight in the East that the Union won the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant of Ohio and Illinois, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Philip Sheridan, both of Ohio, as generals, along with civilian leaders such as Abraham Lincoln of Indiana and Illinois as president, Governor Oliver Morton, and U.S. Representative George Julian of Indiana, Supreme Court Justice Salmon Chase, and U.S. Representative Benjamin Ward of Ohio as leaders, as civilians. Yes, the Midwest was for the Union, but it also had a sense of difference from their Union brethren in the Northeast. Despite the important concerns about the existence of a Midwestern identity presented provocatively by Peyton, I believe that there is a Midwest region in America today. Admittedly, the Midwest has shortcomings that preclude it from being an ideal region, especially its fuzzy borders and internal differentiation. This should not surprise anyone, given its immense size, which includes at least 12 of the 50 states of the American nation. Thank you.
Next up is Adam Kirkwood. Oh, you don't?
Thank you guys, everyone, for coming, and to John, who's here, for inviting me to present. I really enjoyed those maps. Thanks, Bruce. I'm a professor of history at Southeast Missouri State University, which is in Cape Girardeau, which I'm probably the only person in the room that was looking and seeing. It's really interesting to me that that's often on the border, or sometimes included in the Midwest, and sometimes not included in the Midwest. I had a great time talking to my students, many of whom are from St. Louis. And my students and I certainly consider St. Louis a Midwestern city. The other closest city is Memphis, which I and my students pretty clearly define as a southern city, and Cape Girardeau is in between. And so we have a lot of really good discussions about, is Cape Girardeau a southern city, is it a Midwestern city? Not surprisingly, the students from St. Louis believe that Cape Girardeau is a southern city, and those from Memphis believe that we're a Midwestern city. And so it was exciting to see some of that differentiation. So I've gotten really interested in borderlands and those sorts of things at Southeast. But in today, kind of revisiting a project from a few years ago. My first book is entitled Patriotism, and draws some of what I'm talking about today. So the title of my paper is Commemoration and Confrontation, Patriotic Nationalism in the Antebellum Midwest. On July 4th, 1855, in Columbus, Ohio, a young American-born man watching a passing 4th of July parade began heckling the marchers, most of whom were German, and many of whom were from a local turned Marine society. When the man threw a stone at the marchers and began insulting the Germans, the turners picked up rocks and sticks and returned fire. Soon men born on both sides of the Atlantic were throwing whatever they could lay their hands on. This quickly escalated when a few of the marchers, for some reason, had concealed weapons and began firing into the crowd with pistols. Just your typical 4th of July celebration, right? Yeah, exactly. Some members of and now they celebrate Red, White, and Boom, which is, I think, very ironic considering the history of their town. Some members of the crowd returned fire, and soon bullets rather than sticks and rocks were flying through the air. In the confusion, one bullet passed through the lungs of a young American-born blacksmith named Henry Foster, killing him almost instantly. The shooting garnered national attention, and the press sensationally referred to it as the Bloody Fourth. The local newspapers published vastly different interpretations of the events. The Know-Nothing paper, the Ohio State Journal, blamed the marchers, the Germans, for inciting the violence, while the Democratic Ohio Statesman insisted that the native-born men ruined the sanctity of Independence Day by inciting the riot. Columbus's Bloody Fourth was an isolated incident. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, it's the only occurrence of mass violence of a riot of this scale in the antebellum Midwest on the 4th of July, which is, again, tailoring it pretty close. But despite its atypical nature, the Bloody Fourth reveals a lot about issues of commemoration and confrontation in that era, exposing contested understandings of what it meant to be a patriotic American in the antebellum Midwest. In the years leading up to the American Civil War, cultural schisms divided Midwesterners, split by ethnicity, social class, race, political party identification, religious affiliation, and gender. Clearly, ethnic turmoil caused the events of the Bloody Fourth, but the timing was not circumstantial. Perhaps more than any other day of the year, Independence Day amplified cultural differences between disparate ethnic, racial, and social groups. Each element of Midwestern society had its own idea of the proper commemoration of the 4th of July. And these notions often resulted in confrontation, if not often outright physical violence, against those deemed not properly celebrating the day. So most July 4th celebrations did not end in gunfight on city streets. What did antebellum Independence Day celebrations look like in the Midwest? Most typically began at sunrise, marked by a salute of rifles or cannon by a local militia or military company. Shortly after this gunpowder-assisted wake-up call, townsfolk would gather and march in a civic-sponsored procession, led by local political or civic leaders through the city streets. Depending on the year and city, these were more or less organized than you might imagine. Sometimes the order of the parade was publicly posted days in advance. In others, it looked more like a spontaneous wave of people than really any kind of orderly procession. If one could be found, a Revolutionary War vet would be led out front to lead the parade. If one couldn't be found, a War of 1812 vet would do. Following their lead, local groups representing all walks of life passed the procession. You could invariably count on some compilation of Sunday school kids, trade organizations, ladies' societies, and local militia companies. As several historians have capably demonstrated, this type of parading could function as a form of popular politics by providing men, women, and sometimes even children an acceptable forum to air grievances or public concerns. as the population of the Midwestern urban centers, which is kind of the focus of my study, as those centers grew during the mid-19th century, parades became sites of symbolic contestation. But until almost mid-century, this conflict remained on a relatively small and usually nonviolent scale. In the Antebellum era, rapid population growth transformed Midwestern villages from sleepy frontier outposts into thriving commercial, industrial, and political centers. The citizens migrating westward from places like New York, New England, Virginia, and the Upper South. And in this cultural climate, Midwesterners developed a unique sense of regional distinctiveness, mixing emergent American traditions from the East with customs brought by the Germans and Irish pouring into the Midwest from war-torn Europe. Through Independence Day celebrations, these Midwesterners sought to establish a sense of regional distinctiveness within the bounds of national patriotic loyalty. This was, at least in part, born out of cultural necessity. The Midwest was not part of the original 13 colonies, of course. Even in any of the maps that I saw, I don't think any of the original 13, except maybe Western Pennsylvania, was included into that region. And so hadn't taken part in the successful rebellion from the mother country in the 1770s and 80s. Much of the region also lacked the racial turmoil of the Deep South, although certainly there were problems, especially along the borders. So Midwesterners saw themselves as uniquely patriotic, representing, somewhat paradoxically, not only the archetypical Americans, but their particular geography and history uniquely positioned them to be the best aspects of this growing American nation. As the spiritual, if not always the physical, descendants of early New Englanders, Midwesterners appropriated John Winthrop's puritanical ideology of the city upon the hill, adapting the concept to the American Midwest. Americans viewed their nation as the new Rome or the new Promised Land, with the Midwest in particular representing the promise of geographic expansion and unbounded economic opportunity. So contemporaries link the symbolism displayed on the 4th of July to this puritanical background and millennialist promise. Many Midwesterners consider themselves God's chosen people. And this is reflected if you look at sermons or if you look at political speeches given on the 4th of July. They often refer to themselves as God's chosen people, us Midwesterners that are coming and populating this land. And in fact, 4th of July orations essentially function as Jeremiah's to convert unpatriotic non-believers. Yet at the same time, citizens of these states seem compelled to justify their very existence as latecomers to the creation of the American nation. So on one hand, they're trying to connect to the past, the revolutionary heritage of the nation, through celebrating the 4th of July. But they also want to be a part of what's happened since then. They're kind of in this weird place where the region wasn't yet coherent when the nation was founded, but they want to be a part of it nonetheless. So in this climate, white Protestant American-born Midwesterners molded conceptions of American cultural identity, and by extension 4th of July celebrations, to fit their own evolving notions of a virtuous citizen. So around the 4th of July holiday then, we see white native-born Midwesterners become especially concerned about American nationalism. The development of the Midwest as a coherent region, and more importantly, one capable of fulfilling the promise of the revolutionary generation, really began materializing on the 4th of July around 1826, the Jubilee celebrations of American independence. Now this is an incredibly important 4th of July because not only is it 50 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, although it's not really 50 years, the Declaration was signed July 2nd. Anyway, it's symbolically 50 years, but on that same day, Thomas Jefferson and John Addams both died. And people living in the 1820s really see symbolism in these founding fathers dying on the 4th of July, the same day, and there's all this this imagery of Adams' last words being at least Jefferson survives, and I think that's the order that it goes in. Adams saying I think Jefferson survives. Anyway, but it's very symbolic, this 1826 celebration. So in this context, Independence Day celebrations begin to demonstrate a stronger sense of regional identity. The Midwest becomes increasingly geographically distinct in the 1820s and 1830s and into the 1840s, blending European immigrants and Eastern migrants to create a distinct regional culture. So by the 1850s, who did not fit into this neatly packaged cultural region that's developing? Three groups spring immediately to mind: African Americans, Catholics, and immigrants. In 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a very famous speech in Rochester, New York, titled "The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro." It's better known by a turn of phrase used by Douglass in which he rhetorically asked, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" To him, Douglass argued, your celebration is a sham. Ostensibly, slavery existed only in a small part of the Midwest, depending, of course, on how you define that region during this era. But Douglass's point remained valid for free men and women of color as well. In most Midwestern cities with small African-American populations, black citizens avoided the 4th of July altogether. The combination of racist white men drunkenly firing off weapons was surprisingly unappealing to African-Americans on the 4th. Some black families celebrated alternate holidays. July 5th was very popular among African-Americans living in the Midwest. Some would also instead celebrate the 1st of January. And especially, this becomes especially popular, of course, after the Civil War with emancipation. Some as well celebrated March 5th, the anniversary of Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre. So during the Antebellum era, most free blacks stayed away, either fearful of violent retribution or some protesting, like Douglass, the incongruity of celebrating independence while the nation holds slaves. The 4th of July also proved an opportune time for middle-class Protestant Midwesterners to lay their claim as the rightful heirs of the revolutionary legacy. In 1847, Reverend Charles Boynton delivered an Independence Day oration in Cincinnati, conflating Protestantism with, quote, genuine American principles. Boynton unequivocally dismissed the efforts of Catholics, proclaiming that, quote, you cannot build the temple of American liberty from the driftwood of European rivers. Marking adherence to Protestantism as a necessary component of inclusion in the American polity became especially significant as 4th of July celebrations developed in the 1850s, as a rise of Catholic immigration encouraged widespread Protestant rejection of papal authority and spirited reiterations of Americans' Republican and puritanical heritage. Many of the Catholics arriving in the Midwest came directly from Europe, as German and Irish immigration peaked in the late 1840s and early 1850s. Unlike African Americans who remained all but invisible on the 4th, and Catholics posing more of an ideological threat than a physical one, immigrants of all religious backgrounds celebrated the 4th of July with great gusto. In fact, their exuberance regularly threatened to overshadow Native American-born commemorations of the day. Think about it for a moment. How are there so many young American-born men watching a German-American parade on the 4th in Columbus, Ohio in 1855? Well, clearly, if they had a parade of their own, which they didn't, few would have watched the passing German line at all. On the 4th of July, then, ethnicity became a defining factor in determining what constituted a good Midwestern America. Civic boosters and other members of the white American-born middle class opposed foreign-born appropriation of Independence Day. Meanwhile, immigrants embraced the holiday as an opportunity to both practice their boisterous old-world festive culture, think beer gardens and St. Patrick's Day, and publicly proclaim their patriotic loyalty to their adopted nation. A holiday intended to bring together disparate factions of Americans, instead deepens the fractious ethnic rifts plaguing the mid-century Midwest. So on the 4th of July, 1855, German turners in Columbus marched in an Independence Day parade, accompanied by 2 brass bands to demonstrate their love of America, defending their patriotism violently when threatened by native-born onlookers. Today we think of the 4th of July as an opportunity to spend time with family and friends, a chance to eat a couple hot dogs and wash them down with a cold beer or two. At the end of the day, we look forward to a fireworks show with Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA blaring over the speakers. And rarely does racial, ethnic, or sectional conflict mar the modern holiday. But in the antebellum era, Midwesterners often witness conflict and confrontation in their commemorations. Thank you very much.
Next up is Christopher Phillips from the University of Cincinnati.
Thanks, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here. I want to complicate my dear late friend Drew Caton's conclusion about historical events lacking Midwestern identity, or vice versa. A little bit today. In 18 minutes, it's going to be a lot to get through, but I'll do what I can. As if 1866, the first year after the end of the Civil War, had not been bad enough, there came the latest dispatch from Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby. Nasby, a semi-literate inebriate, one-time secessionist and committed anti-war copperhead, had hailed from the rural northwest Ohio hamlet of Wingard's Corners, comprised mostly of white, quote, truly democratic residents who seceded immediately from their free state, claiming America for white men, then resolved against black immigration and passed an ordinance authorizing slavery. They, quote, wanted the garment revolutionized to keep New England, which is spreading itself all over the West, from submerging the entire Democratic Party. Our bark was on the sea, slavery was its anchor, its jib boom, its right forward mast, its bowsprit, its keel, its all. Rather than be drafted, Nasby enlisted and then deserted the Confederate Army, returned to Ohio to found what he called the Church of St. Vallandigham, and then quit the state altogether after Abraham Lincoln's and the Ohio Republicans' overwhelming 1864 election victories. After wandering several border states, he settled in Kentucky in a place called Confederate Crossroads, except it's spelled with an X, not with a cross. Described Riley as, quote, a typical village in the unreconstructed South. Kentucky didn't secede, and therefore within her borders, secessionists is safe. Thank the Lord for Kentucky. Nasby was a fictional character, if you hadn't figured it out already, the fertile imagination of newspaperman David Ross Lockett. Locke was a native New Yorker who moved west in 1861 and began publishing his column in Findlay, Ohio, which is just south of Toledo. Nasby's letters became a wartime sensation, gleefully skewering pro-Southern sentiment in Locke's adopted state. Carried in serial form, it became a Western Republican staple. When introduced to the column in 1864, Lincoln reputedly claimed that, had he the author's genius, he'd swap places for the good of the country. And then he personally thanked Locke for having, quote, stirred people to right thinking and decisive action. What that meant was solidifying wartime Republican loyalism. In October 1865, Locke moved to Toledo to write the Toledo Blade. In the post-war, Locke's Nasby did as little to harmonize this West-battered landscape. His column's principal foil was the nightmarish violence unfolding across the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in Kentucky and Missouri. Loyal former slave states exempted largely from Reconstruction measures and thereby free to defy them. But his satirical target was the angry politics of white supremacy that rent his adopted state, Ohio, and neighboring free states before, during, and after the war, and that prompted Nasby's Kentucky villagers, again fictionalized, to send, quote, a greeting to their brethren of Ohio with thanks for their prompt and effectual squelching of the idea of Negro superiority. These angry post-war racial politics in his home state resulted in the rescission of its initial ratification of the 14th Amendment and the full rejection of the 15th Amendment that gave citizenship rights, including voting, to African Americans. But Locke, during the war and after, did far more than simply satirize former rebel Kentuckians and Missourians and Ohio war dissenters, or copperheads. He established for his largely Western Republican readership the contours of white Southernness: racial bigotry, unrestrained violence, lack of education, blind Confederate identity, and Democratic affiliation. And by creating that negative reference point, Locke also affirmed for readers on his side of the rivers the contours of Northernness: principled restraint from violence, abiding respect for law, educated support for the moderate order, and above all else, advocacy of the Republican Party. School children learn the Civil War as scripture written as binary, that the South lost to the North, and the Ohio River figures as a clearly defined and static demographic and political boundary between freedom and slavery, a virtual extension of the Mason-Dixon line. The Civil War rarely serves as the defining event in the history of the West, and vice versa. Ironically, the story's central figure, Abraham Lincoln, was a lifelong resident of this region. And his story actually only complicates the understood narrative. His was a long evolution from colonizationist to supporter of the nearly forgotten 1861 Corwin Amendment that sought to protect slavery where it existed, the so-called Ghost 13th Amendment. Get your head around that for a moment. To pragmatic president who walked carefully toward slavery's wartime end, to martyred great emancipator. In fact, Lincoln's region suffered a war within the states that had an outcome that we yet live. White residents constructed meanings of northernness and southernness surrounding the emerging debates over slavery and emancipation before, during, and after the war. Ironically, the politics of what I call irreconciliation would soon establish this region, the middle border as I call it, as a front for a far longer war after the war, fought for nearly half a century by internecine violence and by politics, formal, informal, cultural, and regional. This lingering conflict would accomplish the nationalism that in part had spawned the conflict, and ultimately would shape the contours of a later born Midwesternness, itself a legacy of wartime dissent and a response to a new regional geography defined suddenly by cultural identities that were themselves politicized by war experience and by war memory. In March 1865, a federal commander in central Missouri's slaveholding locust wrote this: "Slavery dies hard. I hear its expiring agonies and witness its contortions in death in every quarter of my district." Accomplished by different mechanisms, slavery's death in both Missouri and Kentucky triggered years of post-war violence there and decades of war-driven politics. A four-way struggle raged between occupying Union forces, freed people who tried to exercise their rights of freedom, white Unionists and former Confederates with their supporters, many of them disfranchised, who warred to limit those rights. This is a quote: "Take these bayonets out of the state and we'll show you whether slavery is dead or not." And that was written by a Kentucky resident in August of 1865, as the ratification process for the 13th Amendment unfolded. With some 65,000 to 70,000 slaves still held in Kentucky in legal limbo, many white Kentuckians, quote, enforced their ideas of Kentucky law by refusing to release slaves until and even after the amendment became national law. Guerrilla violence was endemic and debilitated and lasted for years. And many communities witnessed virtual reenactments of the late war as lines of self-described Southern men exchanged shots with self-described Union men, often former federal soldiers. Unionists in many communities called for troops to protect themselves and to support their civil governments, while others begged to have federal troops removed, especially if they were black. Sorry about that. And this occurred after the state elections in which occurred after the state elections in 1865 in Kentucky and the following spring in Missouri, far earlier than in the former Confederate states. Among whites in these states, a racial solidarity took the form of appeals to join what they called the rebel democracy, the pejorative term loyal unionists used for self-described conservatives or anti-emancipation opponents. On election day in August 1865, garrison commanders in Kentucky refused to prevent disloyalists, former Confederates, and even known guerrillas from voting. And election judges certified the votes in districts where secession flags hung inside of polling places. Defiantly rejecting the national ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, Kentucky's legislature then repealed its 4-year-old law of expatriation, re-enfranchising former Confederates. And militantly, they swept into office in 1866, replacing the state's former Union conservatives. The same would happen about a decade later in Missouri. Kentucky would not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976, but that was still earlier than Mississippi. The turn to a rebel democracy would take a decade longer in Missouri, where radicals held power after 1864, but racial politics quickly built steam. In 1866, Lexington, Missouri's new newspaper, the Weekly Caucasian, quickly became a leading national voice in the fight against Reconstruction by tying the struggle of local white conservatives to the resistance efforts of self-described Ku Klux groups, whose advertisements it ran openly. The Caucasian pushed disfranchised white Missourians to resist by fraudulently taking the ironclad oath, voting, establishing alternative polls for voting, and suing in courts. In its first issue, St. Joseph's Missouri Vindicator's editor blared this: "We are Caucasian in blood, in birth, and in prejudice." In Osage County, Missouri, wartime unionist Levius Zebeli refused to sign the loyalty oath and founded what he called the Unterrified Democrat, among the longest-running newspapers currently published in the state of Missouri. Those Democrats are a little more terrified today than they have been in a while, I suspect, in Missouri. But nonetheless, by wide margins, both of these former slave states soon rejected the 14th and 15th Amendments, unleashing racial frenzies in both. Across the rivers, in the region's free states, a different form of post-war warfare began immediately after its conclusion. War triumphalism temporarily overrode Democrats' negrophobic rants, and that was a term used then by Republicans. And Republicans effectively used emancipation as a purity test and tied Copperhead Democrats to Confederate traitors. Fierce contests mirrored wartime divisions and deepened political animosities carried over from the war as a struggle for home rule that soon became known as the Bloody Shirt. Republican and Democratic congressmen used war weapons or war wounds as weapons, but Western Republicans also drew sharp racial limits to the Unionite triumphant trope, often refusing to embrace even minimal political rights and social privileges for African Americans. Federal veterans led in this new political warfare. This is a quote: "Men cannot go through a prolonged emotional crisis and not pay the price," admitted one Illinoisan. "It makes people hysterical." As self-described Lincoln's Avengers, they now abused those they called home rebels and eschewed affectations of reconciliation. Federal officers like Illinois' Robert G. Ingersoll and Ohio's James A. Garfield turned partisan politicians and told veterans that, quote, "every scar you have on your heroic bodies was given you by a Democrat," oftentimes at those 4th of July celebrations, generally attended by Republicans. Veterans organizations, men's as well as women's, were universal presences at the party's political rallies, helping Republicans to maintain control of state legislatures in this region for as long as a quarter century. Voting like they shot, federal veterans drew down on these Democrats as closeted Confederates. Even when veterans headed Democratic tickets, Republicans, as claimed one Ohioan, quote, "cannot and will not," voted when headed by men who gave all the aid and comfort to rebels they could, and denounced the executive as a usurper of power, and us as dogs, villains, cutthroats, Lincoln hirelings, knaves, etc., while the rebels were starving our brave comrades. Virtually all Republican candidates at local, state, and national levels were themselves federal veterans, usually officers. In response, Democratic veterans coined the term Loyal West to construct a narrative that at once claimed victory headed by Westerners who denied slavery as a cause of the war and protested radical Reconstruction. But they most often were unable to contend. From 1868 to 1900, every Republican presidential candidate but one had a military record. 5 of them were Ohioans, the first being Grant, elected in 1868 by wide margins. As wartime loyalty offered currency for post-war sacrifice, daily political warfare in local communities saw Unionists, women and men, hurl epithet terms, rebel and copperhead, at former dissenters to bar them from church membership and communion. Local partisanship, uniformed and not, quickly manifested into insults, lawsuits, business boycotts, and threats of outright violence or the following through of that threat. Singing partisan songs, as one Ohio music instructor learned by anonymous note about an anti-copperhead tune, quote, "will get your damn nose broke. I'll be at your singing. And if I hear that song, down goes your meat house." I don't know exactly what that meant, but it didn't sound good to me. Many Democratic veterans claimed that they too had fought and bled for a just cause, the Union as it was, the Constitution as it is, and they returned home unrepentant. As during the war, women actively participated in this partisan personal warfare, and they were little spared. Imputing disloyalty, Republican newspapers gleefully published the names of local female recipients of wartime dead letters that had tried to be sent to the slave states. The proposed 15th Amendment put Republicans in a defensive posture not seen since 1860. Only Illinois' legislature, controlled by Republicans, conscious of the martyred president's legacy, ratified. Indiana's ratification required a controversial interpretation of the state's constitutional quorum requirements to allow a vote with Democrats entirely absent. In Ohio, the amendment met with outright defeat in its now Democratic legislature. Even self-styled Western radicals opposed it there, leading Cincinnati's Gazette, a Republican organ, to conclude, quote, a legislature could not be chosen in Ohio which would adopt it. The same state that, immediately after his 1864 re-election, Lincoln had reputedly claimed saved the nation, now became the first to reject the 15th Amendment. Racial politics fueled retributive violence in rural areas of the Middle Border's former free states, especially during and after the 15th Amendment debates. Just as whites in Washington County, Indiana, had accomplished the nation's first incident of racial cleansing in the summer of 1864 that coincided with Lincoln's re-election bid, now regulators of white caps, or Ku Kluxers, as they proudly called themselves, increasingly targeted African Americans as living vestiges of the war's emancipationist term. One former Kentucky slave, Nancy East, living in Middletown, Ohio, remembered, quote, never heard nothing about Ku Klux at all till we come up here, and they had them here. Posses and militia on several occasions were called to quell mobbing and often met armed resistance from Democratic war veterans, their vigilantism now blended with war partisanship. At an 1872 Ku Klux lynching of 2 men jailed for rape near Van Wert, Ohio, which is just south of Fort Wayne, Indiana, members of the mob offered, quote, 3 cheers for Jeff Davis during the hanging. Illinois witnessed at least 20 murders in its southern counties, led by Bloody Williamson, the state's once Confederate and Copperhead capital. In the years to come, nearly 3 decades of what one historian has called commemorative separatism allowed cultural politics by discrete white southern and northern myth-makers to explain the wartime sacrifice of some 750,000 people. This completed a cultural border that would redefine the former West as the North and the South. Commemorative civic rituals such as cemeteries and monuments, and veterans encampments and reunions, as well as loyal Republican organizations north of the Ohio and lost cause organizations, mostly Democratic, south of it, were fueled by popular literature in the form of stilted memoirs and county histories and novels. And they created mutually exclusive communities and counter-narratives in which Ohioans, Indianans, and Illinoisans were uniformly loyal, and Missourians and Kentuckians were even more uniformly disloyal. Erased from these war memories were the majority populations of white and black Unionists in these former slave states who had served in the federal ranks and who maintained support for the wartime Union, and north of the river, the dissenters like Clement Vallandigham, remembered only by Edward Everett Hale's biting anti-dissent short story, Man Without a Country. Discreetly inverting Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is politics by other means, white residents in this region employed politics as other means to achieve war goals. They rewrote war narratives to conform with or oppose the war's national outcomes. Nasby's genius was manipulating cultural politics to influence formal politics to anti-slavery Republicans' advantage, a process that also was at work in former slave states in inverse, with pro-slavery Democrats there the ultimate victors. Winning these wars took a half a century, but they fully divided these former free and slave states who had once mostly fought on the same side in this war for union. In these former free states, war dissenters, especially rural, were largely bypassed by the post-war modernization in places like Cleveland and Milwaukee, in Indiana, Indianapolis, and especially Chicago. These growing railroad cities benefited from economic nationalism as an engine of victory to transform the upper Yankee portions of their region. But in the rivered butternut portions, the central and southern parts, and along the rivers, rather than simply align with what one historian has claimed national thinking to triumph over narrow regional concerns, a variant regionalism emerged in complement with the anti-emancipation loyal West narrative, and it complicated the North-South binary. Rejecting urban, northern-style centralization during the intense struggle over nationalism, these residents honed to a traditionalism as a guardrail against northern-associated centralization in the form of resurgent white supremacy and conservative racial traditions in the form of black exclusion laws, sundown towns, and white capitals. During the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, its strongest membership and national leadership hailed from this former butternut region, especially Indiana's. Small-town editors like Emporia, Kansas's William Allen White in the 1920s coined the term Midwest, attaching tropes of pastoralism and social progress and independence, democratic egalitarianism, civic virtue as a counterweight to the angry conservatism that prevailed even in White's his own Union triumphant state, Kansas. Rather than denote an absence of regions or an anti-region, as Drew once called it, Midwestern identity, I believe, reflects an unreconciled intra-regional contest over the meanings and outcomes of that distant war. Loss as much as victory defined the new regionalism on both sides of the rivers. Its shadows of dissent showing as recurrent populist revolts that stretched most recently in the election of Donald Trump. Among the bitter fruits of the Civil War and its aftermath in this middle region was a struggle for ownership of new definitions that masked successive unreconciled conflicts before, during, and after the Civil War. The border that now defined them was completed only after the political culture of sectional moderation was replaced with the angry cultural politics of region. The national confluence that was once the West was remade as the South, the North, and the Midwest, symbolized by its now 9 rivers. Thanks very much.
Let's hope that works. Let's hope that works. I have no idea. Just stop totally dependent on that. So turn it off and here it comes. Maybe. It's working now. It's as if I'm an former AD guy, that's weird.
Thank you, so that's kind of a relief. Those are 3 really good papers. John Love twisted my arm to be here because I'm on another panel. What I'm going to do is just kind of read off the slideshow, so it's a tremendous relief that it get propped up, but I wanted to, believe me. So anyway, I wanted to thank John for recruiting me, and I've been to, this is my 4th one of these conferences in a row, starting in Hudson, Wisconsin, and here I am. And my life history is kind of interesting because I am a Midwesterner from Minnesota, lived there the first 27 years of my life, and then moved to California very reluctantly and taught there for 40 years, and I just moved back to the Midwest, but not to the heartland of Minnesota, but to Cincinnati. And I'm learning a lot about borderlands, and but anyway, wonderful papers. And what I'm going to talk about here is a potential book project, because I spent 40 years thinking about the West and California, but I'm a Midwesterner at heart, and so now that I've returned and with John Love's prodding, I think I have a book underway about the Midwest. So a lot of the things you're going to see are kind of conjectural, but a title would be, you know, this is very, so anyway, any ideas you have? And so Midwestern roots are regional theory, cultural pluralism, and proletarian protest, 1893 to 1951. Wow, that's sweeping. So impressed with the focus of these other papers. So, and a subtitle could be From Hamlin Garland to Nelson Algren. How do you like that? And many other people in between. So here we go. I'll just narrate this, and you'll rapidly discover I'm kind of a klutz with technology, but here we go. So part one, the birth of the Midwest, and the Columbian Exposition, and three architects of Midwestern identity and regional theory. And I focus here on Frank Lloyd Wright, and you know, it's very interesting. When did the Midwest emerge? And Adam, right? You see it so early. Bruce, you're kind of moving toward my camp here. I think that when you actually use the term, it's part of the vocabulary, then it becomes a reality in people's minds. We could argue this, but so my dating of the emergence of the Midwest is in the 1890s, believe it or not. So here we go. And so I begin kind of perversely with Frank Lloyd Wright. And his prairie house, his first prairie house, 1902, the Ward Village House. And Frank Lloyd Wright started using the term Midwest or Middle West as he developed this, you know, and I go into this in some length in my writing, but he argues here the real American spirit capable of judging an issue for itself upon its merits lies in the West and Middle West. People began using this term in the 1890s. And Frank Lloyd, 1880s. Okay, we'll talk about this. We have people interested. Yeah.
The Midwest in the 20s. Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the Midwest, Middle West. Okay. So here he is doing it, and we in the Middle West are living on the prairie. The prairie has a beauty of its own, and we should accentuate this natural beauty. I love the prairie by instinct as great, and the great simplicity of the trees, the flowers, the sky itself. Thrilling by contrast. Frank Lloyd Wright, what a character. The next person is Hamlin Garland. And actually, chronologically, I should have begun with him, but in his great book, his polemical piece called Crumbling Idols, and he was at the Columbian Exposition, as was Frank Lloyd Wright, as was Frederick Jackson Turner. He said this: there in the mighty spaces of the West is forming millions of young men and women coming on in this empire of the Mississippi Valley. Some imagine the Easterners caught a glimpse of it at the Exposition, where the Eastern culture and accent was swallowed up and lost in the mighty flood of the Middle West, unknown, inarticulate, but tremendous in its masses. It's a pretty significant statement, Crumbling Idols. And Garland gave a talk at the Columbian Exposition. And of course, we all know about this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner, and I've written quite a bit about him. He's primarily known as the frontier theorist, but he spent most of his life writing about regionalism. And that's been one of my missions in life, is to bring that dimension of Turner back to the public consciousness, if possible. But anyway, here he is writing in 1896, and this is his first use of the term. The West, therefore, needs to be understood. It requires analysis of the regions that compose it. I'll drop down. The prairie portion of the Middle West should no longer be neglected by historians. So here we have Turner labeling this place. It is clear that here within the Mississippi Basin, one vast area covering at least half a dozen states is almost virgin soil for the historian. Let me just continue. These are a cluster of people who grew up within a small radius of Portage, Wisconsin. Bill Cronin, wonderful historian, one of my heroes in many ways, has been writing a book about Portage for many, many years. And right within this, it's a very interesting cluster of wonderful, important Midwesterners. And so there they are. And I'm just going to have to zip on here. But I mean, even George O'Keeffe, born in, right near Portage, Zona Gale, the great writer who was friends with Frank Lloyd Wright, Turner, and John Muir. People forget that John Muir, born in Scotland, his childhood was just outside of Portage. And so there's this cluster of intellectuals and people who are talking about the region. This is some other writers. Laurie Ingalls Wilder, I don't know if John Miller's in the audience, but he's the expert on Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I compared Wilder and Jane Addams, both growing up in the prairie and both having very different visions of the Midwest. So you can see Cedarville, Iowa, where Addams grew up, Portage, Turner, Spring Green, Frank Lloyd Wright, West Salem, Garland, Pepin, Laura Ingalls Wilder. There are many other writers I could have included in this map, but it's an interesting clustering of writers and intellects. Here's some of the urban people of this era who are contributing to this Midwestern Renaissance and thinking of it as a region. Jane Addams, she's so significant. Ida B. Wells, it's a complicated story, but she moved here in the 1890s after a horrible lynching situation that Bruce probably knows about in great detail. Elfield, of course, Dreiser, Sullivan, Sanders, Harriet Monroe, and Reverdy Ransom, a black socialist minister who came to Chicago in the 1890s and had a pretty important impact. And I think people need to know more about Reverdy Ransom and his ideas. So, stage 2, the roots of cultural pluralism, rural and urban sources. And there's a little bit of repetition here, but these are people a decade or so later who developed, not the first group, theories of regionalism. Josiah Royce was the exception. He was developing a theory based on his California experiences, but it was a professor at Harvard during these years. But the Midwest was a place that kind of gave birth to those ideas. Here we have pluralism, the idea of cultural pluralism emerging from the Middle West and from both rural and urban sources. And I'm going to give a paper on Horace Kalin in the afternoon, who was very central to it. So we have Addams, and few people, I don't think too many people recognize the fact that Jane Addams actually scooped Horace Kalin on the idea of cultural pluralism by a few years. And so the comparison between these two, she being a native Midwesterner, Kalin being an interloper, is very interesting. Randolph Bourne, well, here, let me probably have to zip through this, but Randolph Bourne, very famous you all know about Randolph Bourne, amazing man who came to the Midwest and was inspired by the Midwest and was crucial in a pluralistic theory. He called it transnational America. Reverdy Ransom, I just mentioned him, socialist black minister, Ida B. Wells, and then here's my Minnesota intonation, only roll log. I'm a Scandinavian background, Minnesota. I taught Giants here for 40 years. And then someone you've probably not heard of, Vladimir Auger, a Norwegian journalist from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, who developed a pluralistic theory. So these are some of the people that I see as being important in this kind of central episode. And so I have a quote from Jane Addams. And I don't know how the time is going here, I'll try to rush through this, but what's interesting is that Addams was you all know this, she was such an amazing person, a philosopher. She knew William James, but she came up with this urban-based theory of pluralism in which she said that, let me just drop down a little bit, it's possible that we shall be saved from the warfare of the fighting rabble itself, but by the quarrelsome mob turned into kindly citizens of the world through the pressures of the cosmopolitan neighborhood. Her notion of a cosmopolitan neighborhood around Fall House was very significant. And I admired Addams immensely. And then she continued to do things after this. But this cosmopolitan neighborhood. Kalin, on the other hand, or Kalin, in moving to Cincinnati, I had access to the Hebrew Union College archive, 99 boxes of Kalin material. Oh my God! So that's how my energies have gone there. This guy was I think, well, I'll talk about him later. But he moved to Wisconsin, and that was to put the finishing touch between 1911 and 1918 on his theory of cultural pluralism. And it was the catalyst. It was the catalyst. So anyway, I won't bother to read this because I think time is, well, maybe I will. The spacious continent has permitted the spontaneous, self-rooting, and automatic growth of differentiated communities. He added a geographical dimension to it. And ironically, he grew up in Boston in a very urban ghetto environment, comes to Madison, and kind of rural geography with its cultural diversity helped inspire his fulfilled theory of cultural pluralism. It's an interesting story. So he says, in the spaces of the continent, democracy could not but prevail, and the lives of cultural groups retain their integrities, even as the lives of individual spirits. Now, he wasn't a great writer. Sometimes he would rise to the occasion. He wrote so much. Well, you'll hear about that later. Too much. In manyness, variety, differentiation lies the vitality of such oneness as may compose cultural pluralism. Cultural growth is founded on cultural pluralism. The first time that phrase was published, 1924. He came up with it in 1908. I'll talk about that later. But this was the first publication of that word, those two words. Randolph Bourne visited Kalin in Madison in 1917. He had just written an essay called Transnational America in 1916, and Bourne and Kalin hit it off. And the really interesting, in my book, if I write this book, I'd like to do a little cameo where Kalin and Bourne meeting in Bourne's apartment in Madison, and Max Eastman. Max Eastman was in Wisconsin, and you have one of the most handsome, Max Eastman was a dashing, debonair character, you've all heard about him, and Randolph Bourne was this unfortunately distorted person who talked about youth, you know, was an amazing guy, and there they are in meeting with Horace Kalin. It's a moment that needs a little burnishing. So what Bourne said, he was inspired by the Midwest. And he said what has happened in such states as Wisconsin and Minnesota is that the strong foreign cultures have struck root in new and fertile soil. America has meant liberation, and German and Scandinavian political ideals and social energies have expanded into potency. And so basically he saw the Midwest as a pretty inspiring place for his transnational America. And I find that really interesting, to say the least. And then just very quickly, I haven't done a lot of work on the two black figures. Robert E. Ransom, though, his papers are nearby Wilberforce University, so I can just drive up there if the university still holds together. It's in really bad shape right now. But he was a very significant figure and came to Chicago and really shook up the black church hierarchy and preached a socialist message in the 1890s, and then he was sent off to other churches, lived a long life. And he's a significant figure who needs to be looked at. And then, of course, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who came to Chicago after that horrible episode in Bruce, where was it? Was it Nashville? Where did she have her? Memphis. And came to Chicago, and she interacted with Jane Addams in a very interesting relationship, arguing against lynching. Very interesting. And I don't know quite what I want to do with her, but I would like to bring her into the mix. So you can tell I'm getting sketchier here toward the end. Ole Rolvog, I know a lot about Rolvog, and he was really upset about World War I, and of course World War I and 1917 are all part of this whole mix, you know, the repressive, what happened. And so Rolvog is attacking the melting pot idea. And I won't read this, but trust me, it's powerful. And then people know very little about Vladimir Auger, a Norwegian American from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, who did the same sort of thing, attacking the melting pot and promoting pluralism. So I find this as kind of an interesting dimension to the whole story. So here we go. Stage 3. This is really sketchy. And you'll see 3 Midwestern proletarian regionalists, Jack Conroy from, well, let me just go to it, Meredith LeSueur and Nelson Eldred. And Jack Conroy, fascinating character, the disinherited, early proletarian novelist, Moberly, Missouri. Here's a cover of the first edition of it, I believe. And I think a lot can be done with Jack Conroy as a Midwesterner promoting this kind of proletarian regionalism. We've come a long way from Frederick Jackson Turner here, but maybe not so far from Hamlin Garland. Kind of interesting. And then Meridel Lesueur, one of my heroes. I knew Meridel Lesueur. I'm a Minnesotan. I met with her a couple times, and she's a very heroic figure. And she gave this speech at the American Writers Congress in 1935 talking about the revolutionary class arising on the Mastaba Range, that's how she spelled it, the wheat belt, the cornfields of Illinois. Revolution can spring up from the windy prairie as naturally as wheat. I find this really, really interesting. This kind of thought and sentiment is emerging from the Midwest. Here's her great book, North Star Country, very moving. And I just can't resist. This is Whitman-esque prose. It's very, the people are a story that never ends, a river that winds and falls and gleams erect at many dawn. The people are a story that's long, incessant, coming alive from the earth and better wheat. I'll drop down. The people always know that the grain will be good, some crop will be saved, some will return and bear the strength of the kernel. That from the bloodiest year, some survive while the box of frost. Last line of her great book, North Star Country. And I forgot what I had here, Nelson Eldren. And this is, I used to teach this book, believe it or not. Once you become a part of this particular patch, you'll never love another. Like loving a woman with a broken nose. I used to recite this in class. I don't know that my students got it, but like loving a woman with a broken nose, you may find lovelier lovelies, but never a lovely real. Like Chicago, of the proletarian place. And so we kind of end with this sort of gritty proletarian recognition of a region that is maybe losing a little bit of its centrality, but there's this kind of proletarian dimension. And then I have two more slides, and I'm not even going to, I'm just toward the end. I've got more Meridel Lesueur, but we don't need to see that. But I've got Toni Morrison, who was born in Ohio, and I think she has some pretty, the Midwest is pretty powerful. And so she says here that it's the matrix for me. It is an escape from stereotypical black setting. It is neither plantation nor ghetto. She's declaring her Midwesternness. So that's kind of a brief overview, and thank you for bearing with me.
Is Wendy here? I'm sorry, I don't know Wendy very well.
No, she couldn't.
She couldn't. So why don't we open the floor to questions from the audience? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question or comment for Michael Swinger. I was wondering if you, I know your book is in progress, but if you had considered including James T. Farrell, the Irish American writer from Chicago, his God's Line and trilogy, and Daniel Neal Pentology, I think, deals with a lot of these issues of immigration, how hard it is, how it breaks in the difference. God's Line is better than colonial people. But it deals a lot with the contest over territory and neighborhoods, particularly between the Irish and African Americans. But it's especially the Daniel Neal series that shows Farrell exploring what the urban milieu of America is and what democracy's promises. And and for Daniel Neal, it's the parks. And so we have Danny Burnham and this whole idea of parks being an important place where people gather, and also baseball as Americanizing force. And so it's just, I think it would round out a nice other ethnic group. You have Norwegians, African Americans, and he's really often overlooked. And unfortunately, I don't know why, but he's just a fascinating. You could probably, he's like James Joyce. You could probably rewrite Chicago geography based on, Joyce said you could reimagine Dublin from Dublin, or you could probably reimagine Chicago from Farrell's times.
You should write that book.
I'm telling you what, I know a lot of other people have already written about it. I mean, I do Irish American history, so we're this little clique that somehow the word never gets out.
No, you're right, and again, that's so sketchy toward the end, and I may never get there, but Eldrin was Swedish Jewish, and Farrell being Irish, right? Yeah, would be interesting. I don't know.
And he's, there's a chart some anti-Semitism of the Irish. I mean, it's not always the most flattering, but there are Irish Americans who are struggling with their own being, discriminated against, and it's all of this.
We'll talk after this. Sounds great.
Andrew Wiley, University of Calgary. My question or comment is primarily for Dr. Bigelow. Have you thought about expanding your studies of the Midwest as a region across the Canadian border?
No.
It's because a lot of Western historians right now are expanding that across the Canadian border because people from Nevada and Montana have much more in common with people from Alberta than maybe New York. I mean, if Dr. Steiner, if you would have moved to Manitoba instead of California, you would have felt a little more at home because of the cross-border regionalism. But
yeah,
that was the question comment. I think it might be informative.
Wilbur Zielinski's folk or vernacular map of the Midwest, where he looked at phone directories from major cities. He did, in the map I showed you, include the lower prairie provinces as part of the Midwest based upon that term actually being used up there for businesses. I'm aware that a lot of migration from the Midwest went up into the prairie provinces. I really don't know very much about Canadian history generally, and particularly the prairie provinces.
Yeah.
I think to that too, there's, especially with the political history, like Dave Naylor's book on the Canadian Cooperative Federation, as you no doubt know. And I'm thinking the same thing about Dr. Steiner. I'm very, as a Minnesotan as well, I'm very tired of hearing that I should go to Winnipeg because they would talk like me up there. I'll get to do that this summer, so I'll get to see. But my question is for the first three, I think, especially defining the core of the Midwest as you do, Dr. Bigelow, and then hearing about two different papers talking about kind of this either upland south, kind of what Woodard talks about as Appalachia. I wonder if what you all would consider to be then, what defines those areas as periphery specifically, relative to the core that Dr. Bigelow talks about?
Just quickly, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, and at least southern Missouri, basically what Dr. Phillips talked about, the fact that you had in those areas and still have those that have a very different view of the Civil War, who they were hoping to win, than people further north in those states. And of course, Missouri was a slave state with tremendous guerrilla warfare. For the western region, I think that western North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas are in the Midwest, but their geographical base is different. You move from the prairie to the plains, from high grass to short grass. So physically it's different, but the people that move in there have the same culture as the ones just to the east of them. That's where they came from. The border of western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, I'm really not sure. Just from readings, I put the eastern quarter of Ohio maybe not in the Midwest or periphery. I mean, is Cleveland a Midwest city or a Northeast? You get opinions both ways. So that's the way I
think they're divided. The west side of Cleveland's Midwest, the east side.
I don't know how Zielinski put western Pennsylvania in the Midwest. I don't get that at all.
He lived there.
He lived at State College. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Professor Phillips. I thought you gave us fascinating about the creation of the Midwestern identity on this border region, this rock border region of the South. But what about, so aside from those border regions, what about the other parts of the Midwest going north and to Michigan and so on? Did they see as much conflict, and did that sense of fighting and kind of, you know, your dentist Southern, post-Southern feeling have as much power in those parts of what we think of as the Midwest, right?
Well, there have been a lot of studies done on that particular topic on all of those states. I'm trying to think of the name, Bright Shining Star, the one on Iowa. It's really amazing just how deep those pro-slavery sentiments ran into politics before and during the Civil War, and how those war-driven politics allowed for a universal victory by the Republicans, particularly the Emancipationist Republicans in that state, and yet that there are still pockets within the southern parts of Iowa that are that would conform in some sense to that, in part because what I found is that the rivers were arteries much deeper into these, fingering into these states than we want to commonly assume. I was having a conversation with Bill Freeling once about where that line is, right, between the upland south and the Midwest, and it's always traditionally been held in a political and cultural way as the national road, and now I don't think it holds at all. I think the rivers are better indicators of where people, or more to the point, the lack of access by way of the railroad that is a delineator of where those pockets of very conservative politics show up in those states that commonly are not associated with the upland migration. There's a fascinating book by Brent Campney about Kansas, and it's called This Is Not Dixie, and it is a shocking portrayal of the racial animosity and tensions and conflicts and outright violence in Kansas well into after the Civil War and well into the 20th century that he likens almost to a Southern style segregation of the state. And that parallels very well with Tom Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, in the sort of teasing out some of these lingering and persistent cultural understandings that tend to very much differentiate the urban Midwest from the rural.
So what you're saying is my map of periphery is too simplistic, that a real map would show a lot more in the figuring of the groups.
It would be a really, really difficult map to construct, because we tend to want to have block areas that are one thing, and I find that breaks down very quickly. I found during the war and after in much of these, the region that I studied, that there were very well-known pro-slavery and anti-slavery towns that were right next door to one another. Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln's hometown, was referred to more than once as a dirty pro-slavery town, in part because of the migration there, which of course many Kentuckians who were unlike Lincoln, but also because of the persistent democratic pro-slavery politics that were there, that then transcended into the war and the dissent from the war and the Lincoln administration. So it'd be I think a very difficult. One of the things that I try to do in my book is to differentiate between the idea that regions are made by culture and regions are made by politics. And I'm of the opinion that culture is politics and not vice versa. And particularly in this place, this very broad region, very amorphous region in some sense, and certainly a culturally pluralistic region, politics really do persist far longer than cultures.
Yeah. And that's probably time for our last one.
First, visual. When I listen to your presentation, it reminded me of G. Skinner's theory about the map region in China. I teach Chinese history. And one of the features of theory of macro region is language, it's dialect. So you mentioned dialect in the West. I lived in the Midwest for 15 years and never noticed the existence of dialect here. So can you explain more about the dialect in the Midwest and what factors?
I think they relate to the migrational streams. So southern Midwesterners have a southern twang. The further north you go towards the Great Lakes, it diminishes. But in the Midwest generally, there's a distinct regional dialect. I'm always reminded of my students that I'm an outsider because of my Vermont, rural Boston accent, which makes me very different from my students. That's all I can say.
Well, it's 10 to noon, and we're a little over. Thank you. Really.
Yeah.